For over a year, Japan's Zero was untouchable, slicing through American planes with ease. But on a humid morning in 1943, a new sound cut the sky, a scream like a banshee. Japanese pilots looked up, and the myth of invincibility shattered in minutes. What weapon brought their empire's greatest ace killers to sudden terror? The first light of dawn crept over the jungles of Guadalcanal. February 12th, 1943. Henderson Field lay quiet, the coral runway still glistening with dew. But on its flight line waited 24 dark blue shapes. They were not wildcats, not warhawks. They were something new, something strange. The bent wings curved downward like the talons of a bird of prey. Their long noses jutted forward, hiding the eyes of the pilots within. To some, these machines looked like monsters, unwieldy, unpredictable, too dangerous even to fly from a carrier deck. To others, they looked like salvation. Major William Guise checked his watch. 0600. In just 2 hours, these F4U Corsairs would launch on their first combat mission in the Pacific War. Not a training run, not a routine patrol. An escort deep into enemy skies, where the legendary Mitsubishi Zero still ruled unchallenged. For more than a year, Japanese pilots had carved their reputation into the clouds. Aces with hundreds of hours in combat. Men who fought like artists painting death across the sky. Their weapon, the Zero, could twist and climb with elegance no American machine could match. Since Pearl Harbor, the Zero had been more than an airplane. It was a myth, an untouchable ghost. But myths can die. And on this humid morning, the weapon that would shatter Japan's illusion of invincibility sat silent on the tarmac. Its wings arched like a predator ready to strike. Soon, the world would give it a name. Whistling Death. Yet before it earned that title, before the Zero fell from the heavens it once commanded, we must go back to the beginning of the story, to understand why this strange, dangerous bird was born at all. Before the Corsair ever touched Pacific skies, the Zero reigned supreme. From the shock of Pearl Harbor in December 1941 to the sweeping victories in Singapore, the East Indies, and the Philippines, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero seemed invincible. It could outclimb, outturn, and outlast anything the Allies had. At the hands of elite aviators like Saburo Sakai and Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, it became more than an aircraft. It was a symbol of Japanese mastery in the air, a blade forged from years of relentless training. Behind that dominance lay a doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Navy believed in Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet battle. To them, control of the sea and the fate of nations would be determined in one massive clash of battleships and carriers. But doctrine alone could not win such a fight. To protect the fleet, Japan poured everything into its naval air arm. By 1941, Rabaul, the fortress of the South Pacific, bristled with fighters. 700 aircraft, flown by veterans blooded in China. Pilots who had sharpened their skills against Soviet aces and crushed opponents across Asia. Each was trained to see his Zero not as a machine, but as an extension of his own body. And for a time, the doctrine worked. From Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea, from Wake to the Java Sea, the Allies reeled. Every engagement seemed to prove the myth. American pilots, flying outdated Wildcats and Buffaloes, could barely survive, much less win. But myths contain cracks, even if hidden. The Zero's lightweight design, its secret strength, was also its weakness. No armor plate behind the cockpit, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Every bullet that struck often meant fire, and fire meant death. the Americans learned quickly. At Midway, in June 1942, 4 Japanese carriers were lost. Not to superior fighters, but to dive bombers shielded by desperate wildcat pilots who gave their lives. The lesson was clear. Air superiority was no longer optional. It was survival. In the months after Midway, the Solomons became the crucible. Guadalcanal was contested inch by inch. On its coral strip at Henderson Field, the Cactus Air Force bled daily against Zero raids launched from Rabaul. Pilots flying P-40s and stubby Wildcats held the line, but at a terrible cost. The U.S. Navy knew it needed something more. A machine that could not just match the Zero, but overwhelm it. A fighter that could dive faster, hit harder, and absorb punishment without disintegrating. Back home, engineers at WWII had been working on just such a monster. The F4U Corsair. Powered by the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, it promised speed beyond 400 miles per hour, and firepower enough to rip a Zero in half. But there was a problem. On carrier decks, it behaved like a wild animal, stalling viciously, bouncing off landings, killing young ensigns before they ever saw combat. The Navy called it the Ensign Eliminator. They grounded it. Yet the Marine Corps, desperate for an edge, saw opportunity. If they could tame this beast on land, maybe it could change the war. And so, by early 1943, the stage was set. Japan's warriors believed the skies still belonged to them. The Zero's myth was unbroken. But across the ocean, in secret hangars and dusty training fields, America's bent-wing bird was waiting. Soon, it would fly. And when it did, the age of Japanese air supremacy would begin to die. It began, not on the battlefield, but on the drafting tables of WWII aircraft in 1938. The U.S. Navy wanted a fighter faster, stronger, deadlier than anything in the world. The engineers answered with a machine that looked like no other. At its heart was a monster, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP, an 18-cylinder radial engine delivering more than 2,000 horsepower. It was the most powerful aircraft engine America had ever built, and it needed an airframe just as radical. A massive 13-foot propeller was required to harness that power. But how to keep it from striking the ground? The answer was strange, elegant, almost bird-like. The inverted gull wing. Bent downward, then upward again, it gave the Corsair its unmistakable silhouette. A predator's profile. A warbird unlike any seen before. The first prototype flew on May 29, 1940. As it roared down the runway, engineers held their breath. Moments later, cheers erupted. The Corsair had shattered the 400-mile-per-hour barrier. It was the first American fighter to do so. The dream had taken flight. But speed was only the beginning. The Corsair carried 650 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing. Each weapon could spit out 12 rounds per second. Together they unleashed 80 rounds a second, enough firepower to saw through a Zero with a single burst. On paper, it was everything the Navy had asked for. But the sky is not ruled by paper. The Corsair was beautiful and brutal. Its long nose blocked the pilot's forward view on landing. At low speed, the left wing stalled before the right, snapping the aircraft into violent rolls. The landing gear, too stiff, caused the fighter to bounce high into the air when it struck a carrier deck. Pilots nicknamed it the Ensign Eliminator. The Navy rejected it for carrier service. For many, that might have been the end. Another brilliant design, too dangerous to use. But for the Marine Corps, fighting and dying in the Solomons, rejection meant opportunity. They had no carriers to lose, only land bases carved from jungle and coral. They were desperate for a machine that could take on the Zero. The first squadron chosen was VMF 124. Its pilots were not aristocrats of Annapolis, but a cross-section of America. Farm boys from Iowa, college students who had left behind futures in law or engineering, mechanics who once turned wrenches, now learning to turn a fighter into a weapon. Among them was Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh. Raised in Jersey City, he had enlisted as a mechanic at 17. He knew the smell of oil, the sound of an engine under strain, the fine line between power and failure. For him, the Corsair was not a machine to fear. It was a beast to master. 14,000 pounds of controlled violence. If you could tame it, you held death's own scythe. Training was harsh. The Corsair demanded respect. One mistake, too sharp a turn, too slow an approach, and it killed without mercy. 7 aircraft were lost to accidents in the first month alone. But those who survived learned quickly. And when they did, they discovered something extraordinary. The Corsair climbed like a rocket. It dived at speeds that tore Zeros apart. It shrugged off bullets that shredded lighter planes. Every flight was a battle between man and machine. But every victory meant a pilot more prepared for the war to come. By early 1943, the stage was set. Japan's Zero still ruled the Pacific. But on Henderson Field, bent-wing birds crouched like predators in the dust, their engines silent, waiting for the order to hunt. And soon, they would. February 12th, 1943. The morning air over Henderson Field was heavy with heat and silence. On the coral runway, 12 Corsairs stood ready. Their bent wings caught the light of dawn, casting shadows like talons stretched across the earth. For the pilots of VMF 124, it was no longer training. No more practice dogfights over San Diego. No more lectures on tactics or diagrams of the Zero's turning radius. This was war, and for most of them, it would be the very first time they met the enemy. Major William Guise led the squadron. Behind him sat Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh. The mechanic turned aviator, his hands steady on the throttle. Each man knew the rules drilled into them again and again. Never turn with a Zero. Never fight slow. Hit, climb, and strike again. Use speed as a shield. Use firepower as a sword. At 800 hours, engines roared to life. One by one, the Corsairs clawed into the sky, their propellers shredding the morning calm into thunder. The mission was simple: escort a PBY Catalina rescue plane to Sandfly Bay and bring 2 downed airmen home. A milk run, some thought. But war has no milk runs. At 18,000 feet, the Corsairs spread into formation. Below them, the Catalina lumbered at 2,000 feet. Slow, vulnerable, an easy target. Minutes ticked by. Eyes scanned the horizon. And then, Walsh's voice crackled over the radio. "Bandits, 8 o'clock low, climbing." 9 Zeros rose from the southeast. Veterans, most likely from Buen or Balalai, men who had already killed, perhaps many times before. The myth of Japanese air mastery flew with them. Walsh rolled his Corsair inverted. The earth spun above him. He pulled hard into a split, so diving from 18,000 feet. The Corsair screamed downward, the airspeed indicator surging past 350, then 400, then 425 miles per hour. At such speed, the Zero could not follow. Its wings would tear free under the strain. Walsh steadied the gun sight. A Japanese fighter filled the reticle. He pressed the trigger. 650 caliber Brownings thundered as one. A storm of incendiary rounds tore into the Zero's fragile frame. There was no fireball, no explosion. The aircraft simply came apart, disintegrating in mid-air as if crushed by an invisible hammer. The pilot never escaped. "1 pass, 1 kill." Walsh pulled up, the G-forces slamming him into his seat, and above, more Corsairs followed his lead. They slashed through the Japanese formation, diving, firing, climbing away before the enemy could react. The Zeros tried to twist into turning fights, but the Corsairs refused. They fought vertically, not horizontally. In the space of 4 minutes, the hunters became the hunted. 3 Japanese fighters fell in flames. Not one Corsair was hit. Not one was lost. When the survivors limped back to Rabaul that evening, their debriefing was grim. The enemy had unleashed something new, something fast, something terrifying. Their report read, "Encountered new American fighter, superior speed, exceptional firepower, cannot engage in traditional turning combat. Armor negates 7.7 millimeter effectiveness. Request immediate intelligence." Within days, the name spread. The bent-wing bird that screamed in a dive became known to Japanese pilots as Whistling Death. From that moment, the balance of the Solomon skies began to shift. Japanese bombers that once needed a dozen escorts now demanded 30. Yet even then, many never returned. The myth of the Zero was cracking. For the young Americans of VMF 124, the baptism of fire was over. They had proven their machine, and themselves. But this was only the beginning. More battles awaited, bigger, bloodier, and more decisive. For now, though, Henderson Field buzzed with new confidence. The bent-wing devils had tasted combat, and the Pacific would never be the same. The weeks after Guadalcanal were a test of endurance. Corsairs now flew daily from Henderson Field, their bent wings cutting dark shadows across the sky. Each mission brought the same lessons. The Zero could still climb, it could still turn. But the days when it ruled the heavens were slipping away. By March 1943, the Solomons had become a killing ground. Every morning the sirens wailed across Henderson Field. Every evening, smoke trails lingered in the fading light. The ghosts of battles fought at 20,000 feet. On April 1st, Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh led 4 Corsairs on a sweep over the Russell Islands. 30 Zeros rose to meet them. In another year, such odds would have spelled death. But not now. Walsh kept his flight high. They waited. The Zeros climbed, straining, hanging on their propellers. That was the moment. The Corsairs dove. One by one, they slashed downward like hawks. Guns roared. Bursts of tracer fire lit the sky. And before the Japanese could recover, the Americans were climbing again, untouched. In 7 minutes, Walsh destroyed 3 enemy fighters. His wingman shot down 2 more. When the smoke cleared, 11 Zeros were falling into the sea. Not a single Corsair was lost. The balance had shifted. The weapon once feared as unbeatable was now prey, and the hunters knew it. But the climax was not just measured in kills. It was measured in terror. Japanese pilots, men who once carried themselves with the certainty of invincibility, began to dread the sound. The whistle of air rushing through the Corsair's wing roots during a dive. It was a banshee scream, a sound that meant death was seconds away. They called it whistling death. On the ground, soldiers learned to fear it, too. The scream overhead was the prelude to machine gun fire, to bombs dropped with surgical precision. Veterans wrote in diaries of sleepless nights, listening for the sound that told them the Reaper was near. By June 1943, the scale of battle reached new heights. Over Guadalcanal, 32 Corsairs from 4 Marine squadrons rose to intercept more than 100 Japanese aircraft. Bombers, fighters, all pushing south to crush the American foothold. What followed was slaughter. Corsairs dove into the formation with unmatched speed. Zeros twisted desperately, but the Americans never lingered. Dive, fire, climb, again and again. When it ended, 77 Japanese planes were gone. Only 6 Corsairs were lost, a kill ratio of more than 13 to 1. Lieutenant Commander Teichi Tanemitsu, one of Japan's seasoned aces, survived the battle. His words were stark. "The new American fighters do not fight as we do. They strike from above like hawks, fire their terrible guns, and climb away before we can react. Our Zero is no longer superior. We are being slaughtered by an enemy we cannot catch and cannot escape." Then came the Black Sheep. VMF 214, led by Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, a misfit squadron, forged from replacements and rejects. But in their Corsairs, they became executioners of the air. In just 84 days of combat, the Black Sheep destroyed 97 Japanese aircraft. They lost only 12 of their own. On September 16, 1943, Boyington led 24 Corsairs over Balale. 50 Zeros rose to meet them. The odds were brutal. But Boyington had taught his men one truth: stay high, stay fast. Never give the enemy a predictable target. The battle exploded into a three-dimensional ballet of death. Corsairs dived from the sun, guns spitting fire. Zeros tried to twist and climb, but they bled energy too quickly. One after another, they fell. By the time the Black Sheep returned to base, 20 Japanese planes were gone. Not a single Corsair had been lost. Boyington himself claimed 5 in that single day, an ace in a day. At Rabaul, the heart of Japan's South Pacific air power, the truth could no longer be hidden. Reports arrived daily. Pilots killed, formations annihilated. Commanders withdrew their most experienced men, sending them back to Japan to train new recruits. But replacements arrived with barely 60 hours in the cockpit. Boys, sent against killers flying the deadliest machine in the Pacific. The outcome was predictable and tragic. Japanese diaries began to tell the story of despair. Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi, one of the few surviving aces, wrote bitterly, "Today I watched 12 of our fighters engage 8 American Corsairs. Within minutes, 9 of ours were burning. I did not attempt to help. What could one more Zero do? The war in the air is lost. We are already dead. Our bodies simply have not realized it yet." Technically, the reasons were clear. The Corsair could dive at speeds the Zero could not match. Its armor stopped 20mm shells. Its self-sealing tanks refused to burn, and its 6 Browning shredded enemy planes into fragments. But the greater truth was psychological. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American pilots entered combat with confidence, and Japanese pilots entered combat with fear. The myth of the Zero had died. And with it, the soul of Japan's naval air arm was bleeding out. In the summer skies of 1943 and 1944, the climax of the Corsair story was written. Not in ink, not in reports, but in fire and smoke, in wreckage falling into the sea, in the whistle of death itself. For the Americans, the message was clear. The balance of the Pacific had shifted. For the Japanese, the reality was darker still. Air superiority, the very foundation of their empire, was gone. The climax had arrived. And it was decisive. When the echoes of gunfire faded, when the contrails dissolved into the Pacific sky, the consequences became undeniable. The Corsair had not just won battles. It had rewritten the rules of air war. By late 1943, Rabaul, the fortress of the South Pacific, was no longer a launching pad. It was a prison. 5 airfields lay cratered, their runways shattered by bombs. Simpson Harbor, once filled with proud Japanese cruisers, had become a graveyard of twisted hulls. The soldiers stationed there, over 100,000 men, were stranded, bypassed, left to rot as the war moved on. And the Corsair had been the blade that cut those supply lines. For the Japanese Navy, the cost was unbearable. The cream of their aviators, men trained for years, men who had mastered their Zeros like samurai with blades, were gone. 2,000 naval aviators perished in the Solomons campaign alone. Each loss was more than a statistic. Each was an instructor, a leader, an irreplaceable reservoir of experience. In their place came boys, rushed through training with barely 60 hours in the cockpit. Some had never even fired their guns in live practice. They were sent into combat against hardened American squadrons, against Corsairs that forgave no mistakes. The result was slaughter. American pilots, once hesitant, were now confident hunters. The Corsair gave them speed to escape when outnumbered, armor to survive when hit, and firepower to kill with certainty. It turned average men into aces, and aces into legends. For the United States, the effect rippled far beyond the Solomons. The island-hopping campaign, those bold leaps across the Pacific, could never have succeeded without air supremacy. Every landing at New Georgia, Bougainville, and the Marshalls was covered by Corsair squadrons overhead. Every convoy that braved Japanese waters sailed beneath the protection of bent-wing shadows. Where once the Zero had dictated the terms of battle, now the Corsair guaranteed American dominance. Even strategy itself shifted. Japan had prepared for a decisive naval engagement, a clash of fleets where the Zero would cripple American carriers. But that battle never came. Instead, American air power isolated strongholds like Rabaul, neutralized them without costly invasions, and moved ever closer to the home islands. The Corsair was not merely a fighter. It was a tool of strategy, a scalpel that carved Japan's empire into pieces. On the home front, headlines told the story of victory. Photographs of Corsair pilots grinning beside their bent-wing monsters appeared in newspapers from New York to Los Angeles. Stories of aces like Kenneth Walsh, Robert Hansen, and Pappy Boyington fueled morale. America had found its heroes in the sky, and its weapon of vengeance. In Tokyo, the reaction was darker. Reports from the front grew grim. Commanders urged new tactics, new aircraft, anything to stem the tide. But industry could not keep pace. The factories lacked resources, the pilots lacked time, and the Corsair never stopped coming. By early 1944, the consequences were carved into the numbers. In just 1 year of combat, Corsairs destroyed more than 600 Japanese aircraft, while losing fewer than 80 of their own. An 11-to-1 kill ratio. Not combat, execution. The aftermath was more than strategic. It was psychological. For the first time in the war, Japanese pilots entered battle expecting defeat. Some feigned illness to avoid flying against Corsairs. Others took to the air with fatalistic acceptance, knowing they would not return. The myth of Japanese invincibility, the spirit that had carried them from Pearl Harbor to Singapore, was gone. For the Americans, the Corsair symbolized a turning tide. For the Japanese, it marked the beginning of the end. The aftermath of the Corsair's arrival wasn't measured only in wreckage, but in something deeper. The death of belief. The recognition that the Zero's age was over, and the Pacific skies now belonged to a new predator. When the war ended, the bent-wing bird did not fade into silence. The Corsair carried its legend far beyond the Solomons. In the Philippines campaign of 1944, Marine squadrons launched from carriers at last. The Ensign Eliminator, once banished from flight decks, had returned as a trusted guardian of the fleet. Over Leyte Gulf, it shielded convoys, bombed Japanese strongholds, and tore kamikazes from the sky before they could strike. At Okinawa, Corsairs became hunters of desperation, intercepting suicide aircraft with ruthless efficiency. For sailors watching from the decks below, their scream overhead was no longer terror, but salvation. After 1945, the Corsair's shadow stretched into new wars. In Korea, it flew 80% of U.S. Navy and Marine close air support missions. The F4U variant, with a stronger engine and heavier load, carried 4,000 pounds of ordnance. It fought not as a duelist in the sky, but as a relentless hammer, striking tanks, bridges, and convoys with precision. It even produced a night-fighting ace, the Navy's last, proving that the bent-wing devil still had teeth. The French Navy flew Corsairs in Indochina. Latin American nations flew them for decades. In 1969, during the brief but brutal Soccer War between Honduras and El Salvador, Corsairs clashed with each other in the last piston-engine dogfights in history. 3 decades after its birth, the Predator still hunted. But legacy is not only measured in combat. It is measured in memory, in meaning. Japanese survivors gave it names that blended fear with respect. Whistling Death, Bent-Wing Devil. American veterans remembered it as the machine that carried them from fear to dominance. For engineers, it became a symbol of innovation, proof that radical design and raw power could change the course of history. Even Emperor Hirohito, in his post-war reflections, acknowledged 3 forces that doomed Japan: American industry, the atomic bomb, and the Corsair fighter. When the skies could no longer be contested, he wrote, "Our islands became indefensible. The Corsair was the sword that cut the empire's lifeline." Perhaps Saburo Sakai, Japan's surviving ace, said it best. The Zero was a rapier, light, agile, deadly in skilled hands. The Corsair was a broadsword, heavy, powerful, crushing everything before it. The Americans had 10 broadswords for every rapier we possessed, and they did not need to be samurai to wield them. The Corsair's story is more than metal, rivets, and guns. It is the story of a turning tide, of technology overpowering tradition, of myths broken, and empires undone. On the morning of Japan's surrender, Corsairs flew over Tokyo Bay. Their shadows crossed the water where once the rising sun had seemed unchallenged. It was a silent message. The age of the Zero was over. The age of American air power had begun.